Welcome on back. Let's get right back into it. This is Professor Tatum with yet another lecture for History 1302. In this lecture, we will be looking at the Requiem of Reconstruction, meaning the aftermath of Reconstruction. Okay, that word requiem, I know is not a common word that we use in the 21st century, but it refers to a song sung in memorial for somebody who has died. So, what I'm getting at here is we're looking at the point after Reconstruction. Okay, so please keep in mind these are two different periods. What we're looking at here is after the Compromise of 1877, meaning after the end of Reconstruction. Okay, so keep the Jim Crow era and New South separate from Reconstruction. We'll look at a little context as usual, and then from there, we're just going to look at economics and politics in the New South, look at political and racial violence in the New South, and we're going to see also how African Americans responded to this system of Jim Crow, right? Different individuals will take different responses, and we'll take a look at some of the most prominent ones. What I want us to consider as we look through this lecture is how new was this New South? Okay, how much had the New South changed after Reconstruction, right? How different, in other words, was the New South from the Old South that existed before the Civil War and Reconstruction? Okay. The Old South, we got to keep in mind, was defined by things like plantation slavery, subordination of African Americans, having white landowning elites kind of at the top of the socio-economic ladder. Politics were heavily dominated by the Democratic Party. Again, much different than the Democratic Party of today. Don't try drawing comparisons or you'll get confused. But that is the face essentially of the Old South. And what we're looking at is how different this New South is from that. So we need to remember going into this process of redemption, which was efforts by Southern Democrats to reverse Reconstruction and to reestablish control over the South. The foundation for this, of course, was set by President Grant's Amnesty Act, which had allowed for former Confederates to hold office once again. And we need to understand that this process of redemption went into full effect after the end of Reconstruction, with that Compromise of 1877. Former Democratic elites, many of whom had ties to the Confederacy, began reclaiming control of the South. So after Reconstruction and into the early 1900s, there was a new South seeming to emerge, metaphorically, of course, following this second revolution, so to speak, of the U.S. Civil War. And that process of redemption we can understand as the bedrock or foundation of this new South. So what did this new South look like economically? There were some changes, okay? There were some limited booms in industrialization. We need to keep in mind the Old South, as I suggested, was dominated by plantation slavery. Cotton was kind of the primary means of production, along with some other cash crops. But there were new industries beginning to gradually diversify the Southern economy. There's expansion of railroads and oil, large-scale industrialization in some cities. But that was kind of the exception rather than the norm, okay? These were isolated cases of boom towns, spread few and far between. For the most part, the South still remained primarily agricultural. Some change there, but not a whole lot. But where we really saw a lack of change was with what we refer to as the economic order, meaning who's in control of economics, who's in control of work, who's working for who's dependent on who. That seems to have not changed much after Reconstruction into the late 1800s and early 1900s of this quote-unquote New South. In the New South, white landowning elites still dominated Southern society and the economy through systems like sharecropping. To understand sharecropping here, I'm going to allow some experts on the topic to talk us through it.
After Northern troops left the South in 1877, African Americans found themselves in near-slavery conditions once again. Without land of their own, they were often reduced to sharecropping, working the land of their former masters in exchange for a share of the year's harvest.
Former slave owners couldn't imagine the idea of bargaining on any kind of basis with former slaves, and they believed that the only way they could continue to grow cotton was to force African Americans to work. They had to find some kind of coercive mechanism.
The sharecropping system basically allowed farm workers to trade their labor for crops.
African American workers, they don't have tools, they can't supply themselves with seed and other equipment. This is supplied by the landowner. And rather than being paid cash, they are paid a share of the crop.
It was the economic structure of sharecropping that allowed near-slavery conditions to continue on plantations.
Each year you borrow money, and at the end of the year, often you can't pay it back because the price of cotton is falling and what you get for your crop is not enough to actually pay off your debts. So instead of getting out of debt, they're falling further and further into debt each year.
The only way for sharecroppers to pay back their debt was by providing another season of labor to the landowner. They were stuck in place.
What it meant was that African American laborers were tied down to certain geographical areas, and therefore they found it very hard to use their shares of the crop or other wages they might get to accumulate any resources and eventually purchase their own land.
The system of sharecropping finally ended with the industrial boom of the Second World War. Large numbers of African Americans left the South for factory jobs in the North, leaving behind the farms they had toiled on for generations.
Okay, so we can see what sharecropping was. It was a system in which poor landless individuals, in many cases freed people, rented out land from landowners in exchange for a share of their crop, right? They're paying a share of their crop each year. And we can see that this was pretty historically significant because it led to this perpetual cycle of debt, all right? Remember, if sharecroppers were unable to make their payment in full one year, then they had to make that up the next year in addition to what they owed, okay? So if a sharecropper owes one bundle each year and he's only able to come up with half a bundle, well, guess what? The next year he still owes that bundle for that year plus the half he missed. All right, so that's going to lead to this perpetual cycle of debt, leaving minorities and poor whites indebted to landowners. And I know this video here focused mostly on African Americans and freed people, but we need to consider in the Southwest, Mexican Americans and poor whites throughout the South were also pretty caught up in the system as well. Okay, so some changes here economically, right? We got limited booms in industrialization. The economic order is staying about the same. What about politics? What do the politics of this new South look like? They were defined by what was known as the Solid South. So as Southern Democrats began returning to power during this process of redemption, they collectively managed to essentially kick the Republican Party out of the South. Here we got the donkey symbol of the Democratic Party, kicking the elephant here, symbol of the Republican Party, on out of the South. All right. And they pretty much made it to where no other political party other than the Democratic Party had a chance of making it in the South because there was so much collective effort behind the Democratic Party's dominance. And they called this the Solid South because they had solid control over the South, and they managed to maintain that control for nearly 100 years. Another key element of politics in the New South were defined by the system of Jim Crow, which of course are all based around Jim Crow laws. So I'm sure we've all heard of Jim Crow laws, perhaps Jim Crow system. Who the hell is Jim Crow? Where does that name come from? Well, it comes from a racist minstrel show where actors would dress up in blackface and act very exaggerated, acting out stereotypes of African Americans. Jumpin' Jim Crow was kind of a vagrant. They really just reinforced all kinds of stereotypes through this character, Jumpin' Jim Crow. And his name came to be associated with this system of racial oppression and the laws that gave them a legal basis, all right? So Jim Crow laws were dominant throughout the South, but they were really present in the North as well. So we want to understand really what Jim Crow laws are. First and foremost, again, we need to separate this New South from Reconstruction. This is post-Reconstruction. These are separate from Black codes, so do not get the two mixed up. Just remember, Black codes, Reconstruction, Jim Crow laws after Reconstruction. But these place very specific limit restrictions on African Americans, okay? These were laws based around racial segregation and disenfranchisement, meaning restricting the right to vote for African Americans, all right? So be specific there if you're talking about discrimination, taking away their rights. Okay, what rights? What are we talking about? We're talking about racial segregation and disenfranchisement of African Americans, all right? And these laws stayed in place all the way into the 1960s, okay, into my parents' lifetime. So the kind of basis, the birth of this Jim Crow system started with the Supreme Court case known as Plessy versus Ferguson. Homer Plessy was an individual who was 1/8 black. He easily could have passed as a white man, but he didn't think that being black was anything that he should be ashamed of. So he kind of wore it on the sleeve, let everybody know he was a black man. Well, by the late 1800s, Louisiana had segregated their streetcars. And Homer Plessy decided he was going to challenge this law. He thought this was an unjust law. So he intentionally made it known, I am a black man. And he went riding on the whites only cars, and he was asked to leave and get onto the segregated car for African Americans, and he refused to do so. So he was arrested. When he was arrested, he fought this case all the way up to the Supreme Court, saying that this was an unjust law, that there should not be segregation among races. And the Supreme Court ruled that yes, this was legal, all right? They made a ruling known as separate but equal. Okay, so this is the ruling we need to know comes from this Homer Plessy versus Ferguson case, is separate but equal. What that means is that as long as each race had a designated facility, there was some level of equality there, according to the Supreme Court. All right. I want us to understand. I've had one student who was very confused one semester about this phrase of separate but equal, thinking this was a step of progress. No, please don't misunderstand. What we're seeing here is separate but equal. Okay. Here's a car for whites, and this is legal to segregate African Americans because they have their own separate car here. Is that really equal to that? No, not by any means. That is a piece of crap compared to that nice car there, right? That's separate but equal in a nutshell. Okay. All right. So, what we really need to understand about this case overall is that Plessy versus Ferguson was a Supreme Court case in which a partially African American man, Homer Plessy, challenged legal segregation, and the Supreme Court ruled that legal segregation is okay as long as there are separate facilities for individuals of different races. This is pretty historically significant because it led to further segregation laws to be passed throughout the US, right, especially in the South. Overall, this made Jim Crow the law of the land. All right, and what that means is it was going to start becoming more and more common for there to be legal segregation in different parts of the country. All right, so from here is where you'll start seeing a lot more things like segregated restrooms, restaurants, uh, public transportation. We've even seen images, I'm sure, of whites only designated colored water fountains. All that's really going to take off after this case of Plessy versus Ferguson and the Supreme Court's ruling of separate but equal. So I want to show you guys an example of what separate but equal really looks like in practice and the legacy of it that exists even into the present day. A couple years ago, my wife and I went on a trip through the American Southeast, headed out to Florida, went to Universal. Great trip. Um, and on the way back home, we were little weirdos. We love cemeteries, and we wanted to stop through a cemetery in Louisiana. And we were looking for this cemetery here. We eventually found it. It was a beautiful cemetery, right? It's not quite a New Orleans cemetery, but it's got nice architecture, got beautiful graves and art all throughout it. A lot of above ground graves, very beautiful, well kept. There's some older graves there, but they're very well maintained considering how old they clearly are, right? Well, on the way to this cemetery, we came across this one. That's a casket. Yep. This is what it was like. All right. When we first drove into this place, we got out of the car and we smelled this horrendous smell, and we couldn't tell what it was. And then I looked a little ways down the crappy little one gravel road that goes throughout this thing, and there was this big pile of goo with little patches of fur in it and some bones and teeth, and we couldn't tell if what had once been there was a dog or a coyote, and it had just been left there to rot for God knows how long. No one from the city ever came to pick it up. Then we saw conditions like this all over. There were roofing tiles all throughout between graves so people could walk. This is actually fairly well maintained compared to when we saw it. When we saw it, there were weeds that would go up past your knees out here, acres and acres covering these to where you couldn't get back to some of them. And there were some graves that were broken right open where you could see into them. Very poorly maintained. Okay. See, here's an open grave there. Nowhere near the quality of this other one here, yet it was right down the road. What the hell's going on here? Why would they have this very nice cemetery here right across from this? All right. That's very clearly a legacy of separate but equal. Okay. During the years of Jim Crow, this was the traditionally all-white cemetery, and this was the cemetery where minorities could be buried. So the argument was, okay, they have their own separate cemetery, so it's equal. But of course, in addition to the segregation which defined Jim Crow laws, there's the other aspect as well, which was restrictions to African American suffrage. So remember that during Reconstruction, the 15th Amendment was passed, which granted essentially the right to vote to African Americans and all male adult U.S. citizens for that matter, regardless of race. But there were several restrictions placed on African Americans, all right? Different cities and states would find ways around granting equal rights to vote to African Americans, all right? So they've used strategies like poll taxes. Poll taxes were hindrances to minorities as well as to poor whites. It was much more difficult for them to be able to pay a tax in order to be able to vote. And these worked in a similar fashion in many cases to systems like sharecropping, okay? To where if maybe you've got to pay a $2 poll tax and you're unable to come up with it, the next time you go vote, you got to pay that $2 plus the $2 for that year. So, yeah, you're really going to have that adding up over time. It's going to become more and more difficult for you to vote. Early on, there's also grandfather clauses. These were essentially rulings that if your grandfather had voted, then you were allowed to vote. If your grandfather had not voted, you could not register to vote. Well, if your grandfather was enslaved, how the hell are you going to register to vote? All right. And then from there, how are your grandkids going to be able to register to vote because you were unable to register to vote, and on it goes. Then there were the god awful literacy tests. All right. So I'm going to give you a little spiel here and I'll tell you when to pause. But I want you to go ahead and pause in a minute here and look at the literacy test I've included after this lecture. I'm not going to have you complete it. If we had time in class, I normally give students some time to see how much of it they complete. But what it comes down to is the thing's just fucking ridiculous. All right. So you guys just go ahead and pause, take a look at it, and then get back on here. All right. What was that? That didn't make any damn sense, did it? So imagine being a young African American man who's had a muddled upbringing and in and out of good education as these different kinds of laws and restrictions are passing, and there's a system that's kind of rigged against you to begin with, and you go to proudly exercise your right to vote, and you get handed that bullshit that you just saw there. I could not even imagine. That's kind of humorous to look at now, but I guarantee it was no joke for the people who were wanting to exercise their right to vote. All right. And these were used all the way up into the 1960s. Okay. That test that you just looked at was from 1960. That's the year my mom was born. Okay. To put that into context. All right. There was also continued exploitation of that loophole in the 13th Amendment. Remember, where slavery can exist as punishment for a crime. In a similar fashion to Black codes, Jim Crow laws made African Americans more susceptible to falling within that loophole. Okay. There's a special set of laws here that they can easily wind up in violation of. That can be the basis of them ending up eventually getting convicted of a crime and being used as convict labor. Okay. There was certainly continued use of things like the convict lease system throughout the early 20th century in this new South. All right. And then in addition to these mainstream politics and legal restrictions we're seeing, there was certainly a lot of political and racial violence throughout the New South as well. And just like during Reconstruction, these were frequently public, not always a secret phenomenon. Sure, you have organizations like the Ku Klux Klan who would operate sometimes in secret with lynchings, but there were frequently widely publicized attacks on minorities as well. Look here, there's this ad here saying John Hartville will be lynched in the Ellsville mob at 5 o'clock this afternoon, trying to get people to come. They got the hounds ready to go. Here, this is a real postcard sent by an individual to his family. It says, "This is a barbecue we had last night. My picture is to the left with a cross over it. Your son, Joe." These were the realities of the New South. Don't let anybody fool you and say that these are exaggerations. The proof is right here in the pudding, okay? There were, of course, though, as I suggested, still white supremacist organizations running rampant, not only in the South, but throughout the nation, of course, very prevalent in the South. Continuations of groups like the Red Shirts, the Knights of the White Camellia. The KKK had been shut down somewhat during Reconstruction, but by the 1920s, they had made a pretty full resurgence. So as we can see, while there were some very limited economic changes in the South, politics, political violence, the dynamics of power, and the socioeconomic order seem to have turned back to where they were before the Civil War. There certainly is a significant element to recognize in terms of African Americans having freedom from bondage. Yet there are still ways of continuing that, even with things like the convict lease system, right? There's still ways also to keep African Americans, as well as other landless individuals who had traditionally been at the lower ends of uh, traditional Southern society, subordinated to white landowning elites. And then, of course, now we're seeing perhaps one thing that is new about the New South is there's a legal element now kind of reinforcing this subordination through things like racial segregation and restrictions being placed on African American suffrage. And different African Americans would take different approaches to respond to this. There was no single African American response to Jim Crow. Different individuals advocated different approaches for grappling with this difficult situation. And we're going to look at just a few here. So, one way that some African Americans responded to this was through accommodation. One big advocate of accommodation was Booker T. Washington. He was an example of an African American leader who advocated accommodation as a means to respond to Jim Crow. Gee, that sure sounds historically significant. If I were a student, I would absolutely write that down because I know example of is criteria for historical significance. But who was Booker T. Washington? What do we know about him? He was a man who was born enslaved, and he advocated accommodation, as we can see by this speech he gave, known as the Atlanta Compromise. This kind of summed up his strategy for grappling with Jim Crow. And in this speech, as the name suggests, compromise, he called on African Americans to cast down your bucket where you are. That means essentially to accept your current circumstance and be willing to work from there. All right. So rather than resisting the Jim Crow laws and fighting against the Jim Crow system, he advocated working within the system and accommodating white people. He was also a very firm advocate of African American economic self sufficiency, which he said they could gain through vocational education and hard work. All right. And if that meant being subservient to other individuals for quite some time, even if it was those white landowning elites we see, you do what you got to do and eventually work your way up, kind of prove your place in society by being able to gain economic self sufficiency. And to help young men gain vocational educations and learn about this school of thought, he founded the Tuskegee Institute. He was, as you might imagine, very controversial. While some people fully supported this idea of compromise and a gradual uplift through working hard and accommodating toward a level of economic self sufficiency, others saw this as completely unacceptable. So, for example, if we look to somebody like W.E.B. Du Bois, he rejected that Atlanta Compromise and he ejected that accommodationist type of approach. So, Du Bois advocated advanced education for African Americans. All right. He was one of the first African Americans to have a PhD. He was believed in higher education and in kind of intellectual classical education. Didn't believe that African Americans should limit themselves to vocational education. And he certainly did not believe that African Americans should have to prove themselves to anybody. He certainly did advocate resisting Jim Crow laws. Remember, he was very much an advocate also of providing African American agency in history. He was, of course, the author of Black Reconstruction in America. And his major response to Jim Crow was calls for immediate pushes for Black uplift. All right. And to that end, he founded the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. We'll see that organization come up a little later in another lecture. But in terms of understanding his historical significance, once again, we can see that he is an example of African American leaders who responded to Jim Crow by calls for immediate uplift and resistance to Jim Crow. Right? Much different than examples of individuals who were calling for accommodation, like Booker T. Washington. Another strategy was to just simply leave the South. Right? A lot of African Americans realized that the subordination of them, in a way, empowered the traditional white landowning elites of the South, and they started to realize they're kind of dependent on us being here, but we don't have to stay here, right? And especially as economic opportunities opened up by the turn of the century, and into even through World War I for African Americans in the North and out in the West. Many of them began moving in large numbers out of the South. And this is a tremendous example of African Americans continuing to practice a form of politics despite being in many ways pressured out of the political system through Jim Crow laws. Remember that broad definition of politics of it being a collective struggle toward anything that's considered to have a meaningful sense of power. Well, absolutely. That's what they're doing here. They're working together as communities, helping one another move out of the South and go start new beginnings. Now, it's not all that honky dory. Unfortunately, many of these individuals wound up in cities, especially in the wake of World War I, when a lot of white soldiers began returning home, where they weren't quite welcome, and a lot of them did end up facing further racial discrimination and a lot of violence. All right, so this is kind of the New South in a nutshell. We've seen its political aspects, economic aspects, we've seen political violence, and we've seen different ways that African Americans have responded. So I'll leave it to you to decide how different is this New South than the Old South that existed before the Civil War.